Hey, good morning, everybody. It's part 2 of the Cold War starting right now. Okay, let's keep talking about the Cold War. Last week, I gave you the foundations of the Cold War. This week, we're going to talk about 3 more events from the Cold War, plus the fall of the Soviet Union. Without question, the most dangerous time during the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis. In fact, it was the closest the United States and the Soviet Union ever came to nuclear war. And it was all over the presence of Soviet missiles on the island of Cuba. In 1960, Nikita Khrushchev had taken control of the Soviet Union after Joseph Stalin's death. He had also promised to defend Cuba because they were a communist country. He began placing missiles in Cuba, including missiles that had nuclear capabilities, and he assumed that the United States would not try to stop him. He assumed wrong. Look at this map and the problem becomes clear. Missiles launched from Cuba could hit cities on the east coast of the United States within minutes, and no U.S. city was completely out of range. Obviously, this was considered a threat to the United States. Now, look at this photo. Does it look like much to you? It kind of reminds me of those weird crop circle photos that pop up in the news from time to time that people say come from aliens. Well, U.S. spy planes had taken those photos, and they knew what it was, and it wasn't crop circles. It was a Soviet S-75 anti-air missile. An anti-air missile is meant to shoot down other people's missiles, and it can defend things. The U.S. knew that meant there was something else down there worth defending. Most likely, that meant Soviet nuclear weapons were in Cuba. And you know what? They were right. So now the U.S. had confirmed that the Soviets were placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, and they were planning to continue to do so. In response to this, U.S. President John F. Kennedy decided to blockade Cuba and promised to seize any weapons the Soviets might try to send to Cuba. Soviet ships were headed to Cuba with missiles, and thus a standoff began. The fate of the world waited as the 2 superpowers waited to see who would blink first. After 13 days, an agreement was reached to resolve the situation and allowed the world to relax. Khrushchev promised to remove all missiles from Cuba. President Kennedy promised to never try to invade Cuba and remove missiles from Turkey because it was so close to the Soviet Union. This was the highest period of tension in the Cold War and the closest that we've ever come to a global nuclear war. One of the things that was uncovered during the Cuban Missile Crisis was that part of the problem was poor communication between the United States and the Soviet Union. Needless to say, both countries were a little shaken up by how close we had come to nuclear war. After this, a hotline was added between the White House in Washington, D.C. and the Kremlin in Moscow so that the United States and the Soviet Union would always have better channels for communication and hopefully avoid any type of conflict like this again. Okay, can y'all see that sun coming through the screen right there? I may have to move in just a second. That happened in my last video. As the video went on, the sun got more and more in my face and just kind of annoying, to be honest with you. So I might be back in just a second in a different location. Stand by. There. That's better for me. I don't know if it's better for you. All I did was turn around on the porch, so this is just the other side of my porch. So anyway, let's get going again. Now let's talk about proxy wars. Now, proxy is a weird word, but it just means to act for others. So when we're discussing the Cold War, what it means is that we were supporting one country who was fighting against another country that the Soviet Union was helping. So we weren't directly fighting the Soviet Union, but we were helping countries that were fighting the Soviet Union, or more specifically, that were resisting communism in their country because of our policy of containment that we talked about last week. Now, the 2 biggest ones that we're going to talk about are the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And in both of these cases, the United States was supporting one side of the country that was resisting the influence of communism. And communism was always supported by the Soviet Union. You're going to be reading more details about these wars this week in your reading assignments. Americans didn't always support proxy wars because they weren't really seen as a direct threat to us or a direct threat to our way of life here in the United States. We'll also start talking about them more at the end of the year because Vietnam in particular had a huge change on our society, and we're going to talk about that when we get toward the end of May. Now, the space race. The space race. The space race was born out of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were in a fierce competition with one another with space technology to see who could achieve various milestones or achievements first. This race, the space race, was a way for each country to show that they had better technology than the other ones. And it all started on October 4th, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite into space called Sputnik. Americans were shocked when they saw that the Soviet Union was the first to launch an artificial satellite. Americans felt they were technologically superior. Now, listen up. Hear those beeps? Those beeps may not sound like much, but they were a transmission from space to Earth for the first time, and honestly, that was cool. Were we falling behind to the Soviet Union? Could Sputnik have been the first step toward the Soviets putting weapons in space? Was space even a worthy place to battle for world prestige? These were all questions that Americans were asking after the launch of Sputnik. In 1958, the U.S. launched its own satellite, Explorer 1. Look at it. It's not very big, is it? But it was an achievement nonetheless. And President Dwight Eisenhower created NASA, a federal agency dedicated to space exploration. In 1959, the Soviet Union had another milestone with the launch of Luna 2. This was the first space probe to actually land on the moon. In April of 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth. He traveled in a capsule-like spacecraft called the Vostok 1. Just a month before, NASA had tested the same feat with a chimpanzee, but the Soviets were able to launch Gagarin into orbit before the United States could send a man to space. On May 5th, the United States launched a man, Alan Shepard, into space, although he didn't orbit the Earth. His flight lasted 15 minutes and reached a height of 116 miles. It's very clear that the space race was heating up as both superpowers were competing for space supremacy, maybe? I don't know. But they were both competing very fiercely to have those first achievements in space exploration. After this, President John F. Kennedy made the bold statement that Americans would land on the moon before the end of the decade. And that meant the clock was ticking and we had to get there.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
And with that statement, the United States and the Soviet Union began their race to the moon. On July 20th, 1969, the United States essentially won the space race when Apollo 11 landed on the moon and Neil Armstrong took those famous first steps.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The American public had been captivated by the space race, and astronauts were viewed as American heroes. In the 1970s, things began to slowly change between the United States and the Soviet Union. President Richard Nixon actually became the first president to visit Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, since the end of World War II. An agreement was also signed to try and prevent future military clashes. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in the Soviet Union in 1985, he began to have a clear picture of exactly what was going on in the Soviet Union, and he realized that things were bad and things needed to change. And Gorbachev wanted to be the leader that made those changes. Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States, began signing agreements to reduce the number of arms that each country had in the late 1980s. You may remember from last week that each country had around 50,000 nuclear weapons in 1985. Many of the countries that the Soviet Union had controlled were beginning to demand independence. With all of these problems in the Soviet Union, things began unraveling very quickly. In April of 1987, President Ronald Reagan gave a speech in Berlin where he symbolically demanded that Mikhail Gorbachev tear down the Berlin Wall.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Now, Mikhail Gorbachev didn't, but on the night of November 9th, 1989, Germans came out at night and began doing it themselves. By October of 1990, Germany was reunified. No longer was there an East and West Germany. The problems finally ended on December 24th, 1941. Gorbachev resigned and the Soviet Union collapsed. 15 independent countries rose from the ashes of the former Soviet Union. And that is a very brief summary of the Cold War in 2 relatively short lessons. Now, your assignment this week is going to be exactly like your one last week, okay? You've got reading assignments that are posted in Google Classroom. You can read those at any point throughout the week, and then you've got that one document that'll be posted in Google Classroom for you to answer your questions on, and make sure you hit that turn in button so that I can see it. Don't share it with me, don't email it to me. Hit that turn in button. That way I can see it all in Google Classroom. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. I look forward to seeing you all on Google Hangouts this week, since we don't have a day that we're out of school like we did last week when we had Friday out of school. So I look forward to seeing you all. So those periods of first, second, and third that I didn't get to see last week, looking forward to seeing you Friday on a Google Hangout. Like I said before, email me if you have any questions, and I'm always here for you. Let me know. Sunlight's chasing me.